Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be experiencing some more deja vu here in the playoffs for the San Jose Sharks as they once again lose Game 2, this time by a score of 4-2, and to the St. Louis Blues in the Western Conference Finals. So now 0-3 for Game 2s on the playoffs this year, and it's actually went a similar way as the first two Game 2s against the Golden Knights and the Avalanche did, in that the Sharks weren't actually that bad in this second game. Against the Golden Knights, they had that goal taken away, which really turned the tides in that game. There were a few missed calls in the game against the Avalanche that caused them to lose that one. Tonight here, you could argue that there were missed calls on the Blues, but mostly the Sharks just didn't really take advantage. They couldn't get the extra bounces here or there to be able to be in this game, and as such, this is now the third time in a row in which the Sharks have squandered home ice, have split it in the first couple of games, and are now, burdened to try and get a win in St. Louis to bring home ice back to them within the next, within Game 3 or Game 4. So this first period started off, the Blues were the better team. They ended up getting the first goal of this game from Jaden Schwartz, his 9th of these playoffs. And for the first 10 or so minutes of this first period, that was the case. But after that, the Sharks just completely turn it on. They're playing some great hockey for the rest of the first period, but they can't buy a goal at that point. They get a few good chances. Binnington makes a few good saves. And so by the end of the first period, it's 1-0 St. Louis. Second period comes along, and the Sharks are still playing rather well until Vince Dunn gets this goal, and as the commentator said, it was sort of against the flow of play because it felt like as though the Sharks were getting their chances, but then Vince Dunn just randomly scores for the Blues. But the Sharks don't turn it off. They continue to play good hockey, and eventually Logan Couture gets 2 goals, one shorthanded on a certain power play, and then one sort of a few seconds after that same power play expires, and it's once again a tie game. We're at the even slate, 2-2. The second period goes on, but then the Blues finally get back into this game. The last few minutes of the second period is entirely Blues controlled, and they end up getting a goal from Robert Bertuzzo, the least likely suspect here for the Blues, as he makes a great move, skates by Thornton, and then goes backhand on Martin Jones. It's completely out of nowhere, and the Blues have the 3-2 lead against the Sharks going into the third period, and this is where the Sharks really drop the ball, because I say that the Sharks played a pretty okay game, and insofar in this second game, this wasn't bad. This wasn't like Game 3 against the Golden Knights. This wasn't Game 4 against the Colorado Avalanche. But there was so little desperation in the third period. I don't think the Sharks registered a shot for the first half of the third period. And this wasn't even the case that the Sharks were getting good chances, but they just weren't reaching Binnington. The Sharks maybe had one good chance, or maybe a second one that didn't reach Binnington, but was still like a shot attempt in the first half of that third period. But it was very disappointing to see the Sharks come out with zero desperation, even though they were down a goal in this third period. They eventually turn it on, get a few good chances up until Sundqvist on what was essentially like a 4-on-2, with the Sharks really pinching up in the play in the last 3 minutes of this third period. That makes it 4-2. Finally, the Sharks after that really get it going when they have the goalie pulled, but nothing more offense, and the Blues win 4-2. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who wasn't bad in this game, but also wasn't that great. We know Jones can be better. I don't blame him for the Schwartz one. This one goes off of the skate of Braun right to Jaden Schwartz, who's basically all alone, and it seems as though the Sharks, as a defensive unit, just completely panicked at that point, giving Schwartz time, who was like basically right in the slot, the bottom of the slot, even hard one to make a save there. The Dunn one was a seeing eye shot that ends up deflecting right off of Ryan in front, so that's a tough one to make too, and the Bortuzzo one was a great move. The Sundqvist one is the only one I probably take issue with, maybe the Bortuzzo one as well, but while this was technically a 4-on-2 basically, and it was a tough save to make, it's not like it's one that you expect a goaltender to make. Your team is down only a single goal with the last 3 minutes of this third period. Your team can still come back in this game, and so again, not an easy save to make, but it is one you'd probably like to see Martin Jones make. And so this wasn't his best game here in these playoffs. It also definitely wasn't his worst game in these playoffs, and hopefully, or not even hopefully, we know Martin Jones can play better, and I would say that he should be better going into Game 3 and onwards. Next is Logan Couture, who continues to be so clutch for the San Jose Sharks in these playoffs. We know how good Couture is in the playoffs. He always shows this. They had that stat that I think since the 2011 playoffs, or I guess they say since the start of 2010, but that basically starts in the 2011 playoffs. He has the second most goals, 47, just behind Ovechkin, who has 50, and also the fourth most points behind Malkin, Crosby, and Patrick Kane. And Mind you that Patrick Kane has 3 Stanley Cup finals during that time. Crosby and Malkin both with a couple of Stanley Cup finals. So good company to be in for Logan Couture, who always manages to turn it up for the playoffs. And he does so once again in this game, getting that shorthanded goal, getting that other goal to make it tied at 2. And he's doing his part for the San Jose Sharks. But who's not doing their part for the San Jose Sharks is my next point, the middle 6. It feels like I'm like a broken record here when I mention this so often. In that second series against the Colorado Avalanche, the middle 6 has just not been apparent enough, and that starts with the third line, honestly enough. I called out Thornton for looking somewhat tired. He again is having issues defending here tonight. Sorensen has also looked quite bad. He ended up getting booted off this third line, which was a massive surprise, as I did not think this third line, you could pull them apart even if you tried, but with Sorensen and Thornton and LeBlanc not really working together in these past couple of series, not just past couple of games, Donskoy takes Sorensen's spot. LeBlanc has probably been the best of the 3, but it's not really saying much. This line definitely needs to get going, and I do wonder if Donskoy will remain in that spot with Thornton and LeBlanc, or if Sorensen will be given another try. I would guess Sorensen gets to start the next game with Thornton and LeBlanc, just because of the history that they do have, but I think it'll be a very short leash, and if it's not working, Donskoy will get that spot back. But the second line also hasn't been that better. Hertl has had multiple times in these playoffs where he's really stepped up and taken over a game, but it hasn't been consistent enough. And there are too many games where Hertl just isn't really visible. I don't think that was tonight. I thought Hertl actually had a pretty solid game, a couple of very good chances to get a goal here, but you do need him to be more apparent. He's able to drive a line so very well, and he did that a lot of times during the Golden Knights series, but we just haven't seen it consistently enough against the Avalanche and here in the first couple games against the St. Louis Blues. Because even if you take a look at the Blues game, the first game in which the Sharks had 6 goals, 5 on an actual net, it was a goal from Couture, 2 goals from Meyer, which is the first line, then a 5-on-3 from Pavelski, which doesn't really count, and then a LeBlanc goal. So the second line not getting in part in that, because Pavelski at even strength also not very effective, and Evander Kane continues to not be able to find anything going for him. Again, not a terrible game for Evander Kane, as it hasn't really been for the past few, but eventually he needs to find his way onto the scoreboard. You can't just continue to get by with okay games. Eventually you actually have to get an assist, get a goal, do something in a game that isn't just randomly taking a penalty, and Evander Kane is not yet doing that for the Sharks. So I called out the depth for the Sharks. It needed to be the X factor in this series, and even though the series is tied at 1, similar to how it was against the Avalanche, the depth has yet to really step up. Finally, I'll mention Joachim Ryan just as a final point. I had pointed out, I think it was maybe Game 5 or Game 6 against the Avalanche, that Joachim Ryan had improved, but in these past couple of games, he hasn't been that great, especially tonight. I thought he was quite bad. Just a small comment about Joachim Ryan. I suspect Burns, Vlasic, Karlsson will continue to take on the role of heavy minutes. It doesn't seem to be affecting players like Burns and Vlasic all too much. Maybe it's affecting Karlsson somewhat, as he hasn't looked great in the past few games going back to the series against the Colorado Avalanche. Braun has looked fine. Dillon has looked okay. So the defense at the moment is looking strong enough that it should be able to push through the rest of this series and potentially a final series. But Ryan may end up as a liability somewhere down the line. Hopefully he can find his game again. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action for Game 3. That will be on Wednesday in St. Louis. The good news here for the Sharks going into St. Louis is that I don't think they're as effective as a home team as the Golden Knights and the Avalanche were. Of course, the Golden Knights, one of the best home teams in the NHL. The Avalanche, of course, have that advantage of, very good at home, and also the altitude plays a role there, and the fact that the Avalanche are a team that would love to match up line combinations, and so them getting, let's say, the McKinnon line up against Sharks' third defensive pairing is a huge benefit that doesn't really exist in this situation with the St. Louis Blues. The Blues also have been a much better road team, surprisingly, in these playoffs compared to a home team. I think they actually have a losing record at home, if I'm not mistaken, as I think they went 1-2 against the Jets in their first series at home, and I think they went, if I'm not mistaken, 2-2 in their series against the Dallas Stars at home. Don't quote me on those numbers, but I think it's not a very good record at home. Not to say that you should underestimate this team, but if there was a time that the Sharks could take advantage of a team who is at home and maybe isn't the strongest, can't really make as much of a use of those advantages, it would be the St. Louis Blues. So the Sharks are definitely hoping for at the very least a split, but I could in theory see the Sharks going 2-0 here against St. Louis and trying to end it off in a Game 5, but it's going to be tough. The Blues play play a very strong game, and we saw that here tonight. They cleaned up their play that they didn't have really in game one, and it's going to be a hard-fought battle. Class dismissed.